The chains cut into Elena Marsh's wrists as two guards pulled her through the iron gates of the Draven stronghold. She did not cry. She had promised herself, back in the wagon that carried her away from Ashwood, that she would not give these wolves the satisfaction of her tears. "Move faster," the guard on her left snapped, his voice rough with impatience. He was broad-shouldered, with eyes that glowed faintly amber even in the dull afternoon light. Elena stumbled on the stone steps, but caught herself before she fell. She would not fall, not here, not in front of them. The fortress rose above her like a mountain carved by giants, its towers black against the gray sky. Banners bearing the crest of a snarling wolf hung from every wall, snapping in the cold wind. Elena had heard stories about this place her whole life, whispered around fires in her village. Stories meant to frighten children into obedience. Now she was walking into the heart of those stories, and there was no one left to save her. 3 days earlier, her family's small farm had failed to produce enough grain to pay the tithe owed to the Moonfall Pack. It was not the first time the harvest had come up short, but it was the first time the pack's collectors had lost their patience. Her father had begged. Her mother had wept. And Elena, the eldest daughter, had stepped forward with a plan that seemed reasonable in the desperate hour it was born. She would offer herself in place of the debt, work off what was owed, and spare her younger siblings from being taken instead. She had not expected to be dragged before the Alpha King himself. The throne room was larger than anything Elena had ever seen, its ceiling lost somewhere in shadow far above. Massive columns lined the hall, each one carved with the likeness of wolves in mid-stride, frozen forever in stone. At the far end, on a raised dais, sat a man who did not look like a king, so much as a blade waiting to be drawn. Cale Draven was younger than Elena had imagined, though nothing about him seemed soft or unfinished. His dark hair was cropped close, his jaw sharp enough to cut glass, and his eyes held a stillness that made the guards around him stand up straighter, as if his silence alone commanded more respect than any shout could. He wore no crown, no jeweled robes, just a plain black coat, and an expression that suggested he had long ago stopped expecting anything interesting to happen in his own hall, until his gaze landed on her. "This is the one from Ashwood?" His voice was low, unhurried, the kind of voice that did not need volume to fill a room. "Yes, my lord," the guard answered, bowing his head. Her family failed the tithe. She offered herself in exchange. Cale studied her for a long moment. Elena lifted her chin and met his eyes, refusing to look away first, even though every instinct in her body screamed at her to lower her gaze, like the guards around her had done. She was not a wolf. She did not answer to the same rules. Something flickered behind Cale's eyes, gone before she could name it. "Brave," he said, though the word came out flat, almost bored, or foolish. With humans, it is often difficult to tell the difference. A ripple of quiet laughter moved through the hall. Elena felt her face grow hot, but she said nothing. Silence, she had decided somewhere in the wagon, was armor. She would not hand them anything more than they had already taken. "She will serve in the West Wing," Cale said finally, turning his attention to the papers on the small table beside his throne, as if the matter were already settled and not worth another moment of his time. "Kitchens, laundry, whatever needs doing. See that she understands the boundaries of this place. I do not want to hear that a human wandered somewhere she should not have." "Yes, my lord." And that was it. No trial, no mercy, no explanation. Elena was pulled away by the same rough hands that had brought her in, marched down a narrow corridor that smelled of stone and smoke, and delivered to a woman named Greta, who ran the servants' quarters with the efficiency of someone who had long ago stopped being surprised by anything. "New girl," Greta said, looking Elena over the way a farmer might look over a horse, before deciding whether it was worth the price. "Human, are you? We don't get many of your kind up here. Most don't last the winter." "I intend to last," Elena said quietly. Greta's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "We'll see." The days that followed blurred together in a haze of exhaustion. Elena scrubbed floors until her knuckles bled. She hauled buckets of water up flights of stairs that seemed to multiply every time she climbed them. She served at long tables where wolves ate with an intensity that unsettled her, tearing into meat with a hunger that seemed to belong to some older, wilder part of them. She learned quickly which wolves to avoid, which corridors were forbidden, which glances meant she should lower her eyes and hurry past. The worst of them was a woman named Renata, the pack's beta, second only to Kale himself in authority. Renata had sharp cheekbones and sharper eyes, and she seemed to take a particular delight in finding fault with Elena's work. A floor that was not quite clean enough, a tray carried at the wrong angle, a curtsy that did not bend low enough to satisfy her. "You people think you can just walk among us," Renata said one evening, cornering Elena in an empty corridor after a feast had ended. "Your kind used to know your place. Now you strut around like you belong here." "I was ordered here," Elena said carefully. "I did not choose this." Renata's eyes narrowed. For a moment, Elena thought she saw something shift behind them, a flicker of amber that had nothing to do with candlelight. "No," Renata said softly, "but you will learn to regret it all the same." She left without another word, and Elena stood alone in the corridor for a long time, her heart hammering against her ribs. It would have been easy to let fear swallow her whole. Some nights, curled on the thin mattress in the small room she shared with two other servants, she allowed herself exactly that. A few minutes of quiet terror before she forced herself to breathe, to remember her family's faces, to remind herself why she had come here in the first place. She was doing this so her younger brother would not have to, so her mother would not have to watch another child taken by the Pax collectors. There was a kind of strength in that thought, small but steady, like a candle that refused to be blown out. And there were other things she noticed too, things that gave her a strange, quiet comfort even in the depths of her exhaustion. The way the younger servants, human and wolf alike, moved through the halls with their shoulders hunched, as if trying to take up as little space as possible. The way conversations died the moment Kale Draven entered a room, not out of respect exactly, but something closer to caution. The way even Renata, for all her cruelty, seemed to soften her voice whenever the Alpha King was near, as though she too were performing a role rather than simply existing. This was not a happy place. Elena understood that within her first week, but it was not, she began to suspect, the place its own inhabitants wanted it to be either. One night, nearly 2 weeks after her arrival, Elena was assigned to clean the Great Hall, long after the last of the wolves had retired to their chambers. It was tedious, solitary work, made bearable only by the fact that no one was there to watch her, to judge her, to remind her of everything she had lost. She worked in silence for a while, scrubbing at a stubborn stain near the base of the throne, until, without quite meaning to, she began to hum. It was an old song, one her mother used to sing while kneading bread, a simple melody with no real words attached to it anymore, just sounds passed down through generations of women in her family. Elena did not think about it. She simply hummed, the way she always had when her hands were busy and her mind needed somewhere quiet to rest. She did not notice, at first, the way the hall seemed to grow still around her. She did not notice the candle flames steadying, the faint tension that had settled permanently into the stone walls of the fortress easing, just slightly, like a held breath finally released. She did notice, however, when a voice spoke from the shadows near one of the great columns. "Who taught you that?" Elena startled so badly she nearly dropped her brush. She spun around to find Kale Draven standing where, moments before, there had been nothing but darkness. He had a way of appearing without sound, she was learning, as though the ordinary rules of footsteps and creaking floors did not apply to him. "My lord," she said quickly, scrambling to her feet and bowing her head. "I did not know anyone was here. I apologize if I disturbed you." "That is not what I asked." He stepped closer, and in the candlelight, Elena could see something unusual in his expression, a kind of focused curiosity that seemed at odds with the cold indifference he had shown her in the throne room weeks before. "That song. Where did you learn it?" "It is nothing, my lord, just something my mother used to sing. It does not even have proper words. I did not mean to." "Sing it again." Elena blinked. "My lord?" I said, "Sing it again." His voice was quiet, but there was an edge to it now, something that was not quite an order, and not quite a request. "I want to hear it properly." She hesitated. Everything in her told her this was strange, that a king should not be standing in an empty hall at midnight, asking a servant to sing to him. But refusing him felt dangerous in a way she could not quite name, so she cleared her throat and, self-conscious, in a way she had not been moments before when she thought herself alone, began to hum the melody again, softer this time, more careful. Kale's eyes did something she had not expected. They softened, just slightly, the hard lines of his face easing as though some old ache inside him had, for a moment, gone quiet. Elena stopped abruptly, unsettled by the change in him. "Continue," he said, his voice rougher than before. "My lord, I do not understand why." "I did not ask you to understand," he said, and though the words were sharp, there was something underneath them that did not match their edge, something almost like reluctance. "I asked you to sing." She did not sing again that night. Instead, an uneasy silence stretched between them, broken finally when Cale seemed to catch himself, straightening his shoulders and stepping back, as though remembering, all at once, exactly who he was, and exactly who she was supposed to be to him. "Finish your work," he said, his voice returning to its usual cold precision, "and you will not sing in these halls again. Do you understand?" "Yes, my lord," Elena said, though she did not understand at all. He left without another word, disappearing back into the shadows as silently as he had come. Elena stood alone in the great hall for a long time afterward, her brush forgotten in her hand, wondering what exactly had just happened, and why the memory of his eyes softening refused to leave her mind, no matter how hard she tried to push it away. She told herself it meant nothing. Kings were strange, unpredictable creatures, and wolves stranger still. She had no reason to think about it further. No reason to wonder why a man who had barely acknowledged her existence would stand in the dark, asking her to sing a song with no words. She had a family to think of, a debt to work off, a life to survive, until she could return to the only home she had ever known. But that night, for the first time since she had arrived at the fortress, Elena slept without dreaming of chains. The days that followed did not change much on the surface. Elena still scrubbed floors, still hauled water, still endured Renata's sharp glances and sharper words. But something had shifted, subtle and unspoken, in the way certain wolves looked at her now, as though they too had begun to sense that she was not quite as ordinary as she appeared. She caught Greta watching her once, with an expression that was hard to read, somewhere between curiosity and worry. "Careful, girl," Greta said one morning, not unkindly, as she handed Elena a stack of linens to fold. "Whatever it is you're doing, be careful with it." "I am not doing anything," Elena said, though even to her own ears, the words sounded uncertain. Greta only shook her head and said nothing more. Elena did not know, not yet, what it was that made the wolves around her pause when she passed, what made the tension in the halls seem to ease in ways no one could quite explain. She did not know that the song her mother had taught her, passed down through generations of women who themselves had never fully understood its power, was not merely a lullaby. She did not know that somewhere in her blood ran an old inheritance, one that had not walked these lands in centuries, one that could calm a storm of wolves with nothing more than a few quiet notes. All she knew was that the Alpha King had looked at her differently that night, and that despite every warning bell ringing in her mind, some small and stubborn part of her wanted him to look at her that way again. She pushed the thought away as foolish. She had a family waiting for her, a debt to repay, a life that had nothing to do with kings or wolves or ancient songs. She told herself this every night, as she lay on her thin mattress, staring at the stone ceiling above her, waiting for sleep to come. But somewhere deep in the fortress, in a chamber lit only by a single candle, Cale Draven sat awake long past midnight, turning over the memory of a melody he could not place, and a girl he could not stop thinking about, wondering why, for the first time and longer than he could remember, the crushing weight of his crown had felt, if only for a moment, lighter. Neither of them yet understood how much that single night in the great hall would come to matter. Neither of them understood that the quiet, unremarkable servant girl from Ashwood was about to become the most important person in the entire kingdom of Moonfall, whether the pack was ready for her or not. The days ahead would test them both, but that night, in the flickering candlelight of an empty hall, something had already begun, that neither chains nor crowns, nor centuries of tradition would be able to stop. Elena did not yet know it, but her voice had already started to change everything. Word of what had happened in the great hall did not spread, not exactly, because no one else had witnessed it, but something in the fortress felt different in the days that followed, a shift so slight that only those who had lived within its walls for years might have noticed it at all. Greta noticed, the old cook who ran the kitchens noticed, even Renata, sharp-eyed and suspicious as ever, seemed to sense that something had changed, though she could not have said what. Elena tried to return to her routine, as though nothing unusual had occurred. She rose before dawn, worked through the endless list of chores assigned to her, and collapsed into her thin bed each night with aching muscles and a mind too tired to dwell on kings or songs or strange amber eyes that softened for reasons she did not understand. But the memory of that night stayed with her, quiet and persistent, no matter how hard she tried to bury it beneath exhaustion. She saw Cale only rarely in the days that followed, and always from a distance. He presided over the Great Hall each evening, listening to reports from his commanders, settling disputes between pack members, managing the endless business of ruling a territory, surrounded by rivals who would not hesitate to exploit any sign of weakness. Elena, moving unnoticed among the other servants, began to understand just how much weight rested on his shoulders. He rarely smiled. He rarely rested. He carried himself like a man perpetually bracing for the next crisis, because in truth, that was exactly what he was. His father died only a year ago, Greta told her one evening, as the two of them prepared trays for the evening meal. Sudden, it was. No warning at all. One day the old alpha was strong as ever. The next he was gone, and Cale was forced onto the throne before he was ready for it. He seems ready enough now, Elena said carefully. Greta gave a short, humorless laugh. He wears the readiness like armor, girl. Doesn't mean it fits comfortably underneath. She glanced around before lowering her voice further. There are wolves in this pack who don't believe he's strong enough to hold what his father built. Wolves who watch him for any sign of weakness, waiting for their chance. Elena thought of the tension she had noticed in the throne room, the careful way even senior wolves chose their words around their king, as though testing the ground before committing their full weight to it. Is he in danger? Greta's expression turned grim. Every alpha is in danger, especially a young one. Best you keep your head down and your questions to yourself. This is not your fight, and it would be wise for you to remember that. Elena nodded, though something about the warning settled uneasily in her chest. She had no reason to concern herself with pack politics. She was a servant, a human, someone whose entire existence within these walls was meant to be as small and unnoticed as possible. And yet she found herself thinking about Cale more often than she wanted to admit, wondering about the weight he carried, wondering whether anyone in this cold, suspicious fortress ever gave him a moment's peace. It was nearly a week later when Elena first overheard something that made Greta's warning feel suddenly, urgently real. She had been sent to deliver a stack of freshly laundered linens to a storage room near the eastern wing, a task that required passing through a narrow servants' corridor, rarely used by the pack's higher-ranking members. The corridor ran alongside several private meeting chambers, their thick wooden doors usually closed and silent. But that evening, as Elena approached, she heard voices, low and urgent, coming from behind one of the doors. She should have kept walking. She knew that, even as she slowed her steps, some instinct warning her that whatever was being discussed behind that door was not meant for her ears. But something in the tone of the voices, tense and conspiratorial, made her pause despite herself. Too soon to move against him directly, one voice was saying. A man's voice, gravelly and low. He still has the loyalty of the older wolves. We move too fast. We lose everything. He is weak, another voice hissed, and Elena's breath caught as she recognized it. Renata. He hesitates when he should strike. He listens to human servants instead of trusting his own instincts. His father would never have tolerated such softness. His father is dead, the first voice said flatly. And soft or not, Cale Draven still commands the loyalty of enough wolves to make any move against him costly. We need proof of weakness the entire pack can see, something undeniable. Then we create it, Renata said, and there was something in her voice, cold and calculating, that made the hair on the back of Elena's neck rise. Cross's pack has been probing our southern border for weeks. If Cale fails to respond decisively, if he shows even the slightest hesitation in the face of a real threat, the pack will begin to doubt him on their own. We will not need to lift a single claw. His own weakness will do the work for us. Elena stood frozen in the corridor, her arms full of linens, her heart pounding so loudly, she feared it might give her away. She had walked into something dangerous, something that had nothing to do with her, and everything to do with the fate of the entire pack. Every instinct screamed at her to leave, to forget what she had heard, to disappear back into her small, unremarkable role as quickly as possible. But she thought of Kale standing in the shadows of the great hall, asking her to sing, his eyes softening in a way that had seemed, for just a moment, achingly human despite everything else he was. She thought of the weight Greta had described him carrying, the constant vigilance required simply to survive, as a young alpha surrounded by wolves who doubted him. She could not simply walk away. Elena forced her feet to move, slow and deliberate, carrying her past the closed door without slowing further, without giving any sign that she had heard anything at all. Her hands trembled around the stack of linens, but she kept her pace steady until she had turned the corner and put enough distance between herself and that room to breathe again. What she had heard was treason, plain and simple. Renata, the pack's own beta, was speaking openly about manipulating events to make Kale appear weak, about using an external threat to undermine him in the eyes of his own people. And whoever the man was that Renata had been speaking with, he had sounded just as committed to the plan. Elena did not sleep that night. She lay awake on her thin mattress, staring at the ceiling, turning the conversation over and over in her mind, weighing the danger of speaking against the danger of staying silent. If she told anyone what she had heard, and word somehow made its way back to Renata, there was no telling what the beta might do to silence her. Elena was human, disposable in the eyes of many within these walls, easily explained away as an accident, a fever, a fall down the wrong staircase. But if she said nothing, and Renata's plan succeeded, the consequences could reach far beyond the fortress walls. A pack thrown into chaos by internal betrayal would be vulnerable to every rival watching from beyond its borders. War, invasion, suffering that would touch not just wolves but every human village, unfortunate enough to lie within reach of the resulting conflict. Her own family's village, she realized with a cold jolt, was not so very far from Moonfall's contested southern border. By morning, Elena had made her decision, though the fear of it sat heavy in her stomach as she moved through her usual chores, waiting for an opportunity that might never come. She did not know how to approach a king. She did not know whether he would believe a servant girl's word over that of his own beta, a wolf who had served his family for years. She did not know what would happen to her if he did not believe her. But she knew she had to try. The opportunity came 2 days later, when Elena was sent to deliver a tray of tea to Kale's private study, a task normally reserved for a more senior servant who had fallen ill that morning. Elena's hands shook as she carried the tray down the long corridor toward his chambers, rehearsing words that kept slipping away from her the closer she got. She knocked, and a low voice bid her enter. Kale sat behind a heavy wooden desk covered in maps and papers, his expression drawn with the particular exhaustion of a man who had not slept properly in days. He glanced up as she entered, and something flickered across his face, brief and unreadable, before settling back into the careful neutrality he wore like a second skin. "Leave it on the desk," he said, already returning his attention to the papers in front of him. Elena set the tray down carefully, her heart hammering against her ribs. This was her chance, and she knew it might not come again. "My lord," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I need to speak with you about something I overheard. Something important." Kale looked up again, this time with more attention, studying her face, as though trying to read whatever had put that particular tension in her expression. "Speak then." Elena glanced toward the door, suddenly aware of how thin the walls of this fortress truly were, how many ears might be listening even now. "Not here," she said quietly. "Please. It concerns your safety, my lord, and I do not know who else might be listening." Something shifted in Kale's expression, the exhaustion giving way to a sharper, more focused attention. He studied her for a long moment, and Elena forced herself to hold his gaze, to let him see that she was not lying, that whatever she had to say was serious enough to risk everything by bringing it to him directly. Finally, he rose from his desk, crossing to the door and closing it firmly, then activating some mechanism Elena did not recognize that seemed to seal the room in silence. "No one can hear us now," he said. "Tell me what you know." And so, with her voice trembling but steady, Elena told him everything. The corridor, the closed door, the voices she had recognized, and the ones she had not, the words about weakness, about proof the pack could see, about using the southern border conflict to undermine him, without ever needing to lift a claw against him directly. Kale listened without interrupting, his expression growing colder and more still with every word, until by the time she finished, he looked less like the tired man who had greeted her, and more like the Alpha King she had first seen enthroned in the great hall, distant and formidable, and utterly unreadable. "You are certain," he said finally, "that the voice belonged to Renata?" "I am certain, my lord." He was quiet for a long moment, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on some point beyond her, as though already turning over the implications of what she had told him, already calculating what it would mean for his rule, for his pack, for the fragile balance of power he had inherited too suddenly and too soon. "Why tell me this?" he asked finally, his eyes returning to hers. "You owe this pack nothing. You owe me nothing. You could have said nothing at all, and no one would have known the difference." Elena considered the question carefully before answering. "Because whatever happens to you, happens to everyone in this fortress," she said. "And because it seemed like the right thing to do." Something in his expression softened, just slightly, the same way it had softened that night in the great hall, when she had hummed her mother's song. "That is a dangerous kind of honesty," he said quietly, "especially in a place like this." "I know," Elena said. "I am aware of the risk." Kale studied her for a long moment longer, and Elena had the strange sensation of being truly seen for the first time since she had arrived at the fortress, not as a servant, not as a human, not as a debt to be paid off, but simply as herself. "Thank you," he said finally, the words rough, as though he was unused to saying them. "I will look into what you have told me. And Elena?" He paused, and something in the way he said her name, careful and deliberate, sent an unexpected warmth through her chest. "Be careful. If Renata suspects you know anything, she will not hesitate to remove the problem entirely." "I understand," Elena said, though the warning did little to ease the fear, already coiling tight in her stomach. She left his study, with her hands still trembling, uncertain whether she had just done something brave, or something that would cost her everything. But as she made her way back through the fortress halls, she could not shake the memory of the way Kale had looked at her in that final moment, as though she had become something more than the servant girl he had dismissed so easily weeks before in the throne room. She did not yet know that the true danger was still to come, that Renata's plan had already been set in motion, and that the southern border Kale had been so carefully monitoring was about to erupt into exactly the kind of crisis his enemies had been waiting for. 3 days after Elena's warning, the reports began arriving from the southern border, each one more alarming than the last. Scouts spoke of cross-pack wolves crossing further into Moonfall territory than ever before, testing patrol routes, marking boundaries that did not belong to them. What had once been occasional skirmishes now escalated into something far more deliberate, far more coordinated, as though someone within Crosspack had suddenly decided the timing was perfect for open confrontation. Kale called an emergency council the following evening, gathering his senior commanders in the Great Hall to discuss the pack's response. Elena, assigned to serve refreshments during the meeting, positioned herself near the back of the room, watching carefully as the discussion unfolded, searching Renata's face for any sign of the treachery she had witnessed with her own ears. The beta gave nothing away. She spoke with the same fierce confidence she always displayed, arguing forcefully for an immediate, aggressive response to the border incursions, a strategy that would have stretched Moonfall's forces thin and left the fortress itself dangerously undefended. Elena watched Kale's face as he listened, saw the careful way he weighed her words against his own instincts, and wondered whether her warning had truly registered, or whether the pressure of the moment had already begun to erode his caution. "We cannot simply retreat and let them push further into our lands," Renata argued, her voice carrying easily across the hall. "Every hour we hesitate, Crosspack grows bolder. The southern villages will suffer for our indecision. And if we commit our forces too aggressively," Kale countered, his voice measured despite the visible tension in his shoulders, "we leave ourselves exposed elsewhere. This could be exactly what Crosspack wants, a distraction, drawing our attention and our strength toward one border, while leaving us vulnerable somewhere else." Elena's breath caught. He remembered. He had taken her warning seriously enough to consider the possibility that this entire crisis might be manufactured, might be exactly the trap Renata had described in that hidden conversation. The council continued for hours, voices rising and falling as different commanders argued for different strategies. Elena remained at the edges of the room throughout, refilling cups, clearing empty trays, doing everything she could to appear as unremarkable and forgettable as possible, while straining to catch every word of the discussion. She noticed the way certain commanders exchanged glances during particular arguments, the way alliances seemed to shift and reform depending on who was speaking, the intricate web of loyalty and suspicion that governed every interaction within these walls. Eventually, Chaol made his decision. He would send a measured force to reinforce the southern border, enough to demonstrate strength without depleting the fortress's own defenses, while personally leading a smaller group to investigate the source of Crosspack's sudden aggression before committing to any larger conflict. It was a careful, calculated response, one that balanced strength with caution in a way that seemed to satisfy most of the assembled commanders. But not Renata. A half measure, she said sharply, once the council had largely dispersed, and only a handful of senior wolves remained. Crosspack will see this hesitation as weakness. They will press harder, not retreat. Or they will see a leader who thinks before he acts, Chaol replied evenly, rather than one who throws his pack into unnecessary danger to prove a point. Renata's jaw tightened, but she said nothing further, offering only a stiff bow before departing the hall. Elena watched her go, unable to shake the feeling that this was far from over, that whatever plan Renata had set in motion would not be so easily derailed by a single measured response. That night, unable to sleep, Elena found herself once again in the great hall, drawn by some restless need to be near the space where everything between her and Chaol had first begun to shift. She did not expect to find him there, standing near one of the tall windows, looking out over the dark expanse of the fortress grounds, with an expression heavy with worry. "You should be resting," he said without turning, somehow aware of her presence, despite the quiet of her footsteps. "I could not sleep," Elena admitted, moving closer, despite every instinct telling her to retreat back to her small room and leave him to his solitude. "Are you well, my lord?" Chaol let out a short, humorless laugh. "Well is a relative term, in my position." He turned to face her, and in the dim light, she could see the exhaustion etched into every line of his face. "You were right to warn me. I do not know yet whether this border conflict is entirely genuine or partially manufactured, but Renata's eagerness for an aggressive response troubles me. It is exactly the kind of overextension that would leave us vulnerable." "What will you do?" "Exactly what I told the council," he said. "Reinforce the border, but carefully, and investigate the source of this aggression myself, rather than trusting reports that may have been shaped to serve someone else's agenda." He studied her for a moment, something searching in his expression. "I find myself trusting your instincts more than I trust the Council of Wolves, who have served my family for years. That is a strange position for a king to find himself in." "I have no reason to deceive you," Elena said simply. "I have nothing to gain from your downfall, and everything to lose if this pack falls into chaos. My family lives too close to your southern border to remain untouched by whatever war might follow." Something in his expression softened at that, the same quiet warmth she had glimpsed before. "You think of your family often." "Every day," Elena admitted. "I did not choose this life, my lord, but I would not wish suffering upon anyone, wolf or human, if I have the power to prevent it." Chaol was quiet for a long moment, studying her with an intensity that made her chest tighten in a way she did not fully understand. "You are not what I expected when they brought you before my throne," he said finally. "I confess, I did not think much of you at all, that day. A debt to be paid, nothing more. And now?" "Now," he said slowly, as though choosing his words with great care, "I find myself wondering what else about you I failed to notice." The words hung between them, heavier than either of them seemed prepared for. Elena felt her heart quicken, felt the strange, unfamiliar pull of something she could not name settling in her chest. She should have looked away. She should have excused herself and returned to her quarters, remembered the vast, impossible distance between a servant girl from Ashwood and the Alpha King of Moonfall. But she found she could not move, caught in the quiet intensity of his gaze. It was Chaol who finally broke the moment, clearing his throat and stepping back, as though remembering, all at once, the boundaries that governed their positions. "You should rest," he said, his voice returning to its usual composed tone, though something in it still carried the echo of what had just passed between them. "Tomorrow will bring difficult days. I leave for the southern border at dawn." "Be careful, my lord," Elena said softly. "I intend to be," Chaol replied. and for just a moment, something like a smile touched the corner of his mouth. "Good night, Elena." It was the first time he had used her name without formality attached to it, and the sound of it, spoken so plainly in the quiet of the empty hall, stayed with her long after she had returned to her small room, and finally, mercifully, drifted into sleep. She did not know, as she slept, that Renata had already set the next stage of her plan into motion, and that by the time Kale reached the southern border, the true nature of Crosspack's aggression would reveal itself to be far more dangerous and far more personal than anyone in the fortress could have anticipated. The peace of that quiet night in the great hall would not last, but for those few stolen moments, standing together in the dim candlelight, both Elena and Kale allowed themselves to feel something neither of them had words for yet, something that would, in time, prove strong enough to reshape the entire kingdom of Moonfall. Dawn broke gray and cold over the fortress the morning Kale rode south, taking with him a company of his most trusted wolves, leaving Renata in temporary command of the stronghold. Elena watched from a narrow window as the procession disappeared beyond the tree line, a hollow feeling settling in her chest that she did not fully understand and did not have time to examine, because the moment Kale's shadow left the fortress, everything within its walls seemed to shift. Renata wasted no time asserting her authority. Patrols were reorganized, curfews tightened. Servants who had once moved freely through certain corridors found themselves suddenly restricted, watched by wolves loyal to the beta rather than the king. Elena felt the change most acutely in the way eyes followed her now, suspicious and calculating, as though Renata suspected exactly what Elena had overheard, and was simply waiting for the right moment to act on that suspicion. "Keep your head down," Greta warned her repeatedly during those tense days. "Whatever passed between you and the king, it has not gone unnoticed. Renata is not a patient wolf, and she is not one to forgive easily." Elena took the warning seriously, retreating as much as possible into the routine of her chores, avoiding any corridor or conversation that might draw unwanted attention. But avoidance only worked for so long. 4 days after Kale's departure, Elena was summoned to Renata's private chambers, a summons that arrived with no explanation, and no room for refusal. The beta's chambers were sparse and severe, decorated with weapons rather than comforts, a reflection of a wolf who valued strength above all else. Renata stood near a narrow window when Elena entered, her back turned, her posture radiating a kind of contained tension that made the hair on Elena's arms rise. "You spoke with him," Renata said without turning around, her voice deceptively calm. "Before he left for the southern border." "I want to know what was said." Elena's heart pounded, but she kept her voice steady. "I delivered tea to his study, as I was instructed. Nothing more." Renata turned then, her eyes cold and assessing. "Do not insult me with lies, girl. I have served this pack since before you were born. I know when something has shifted, when loyalties have been quietly rearranged behind my back." She stepped closer, and Elena forced herself not to retreat, remembering her own promise not to show fear, not to give these wolves the satisfaction of watching her break. "What did you tell him?" "I told him nothing that concerns you," Elena said, choosing her words with careful precision, refusing to confirm or deny anything directly. "I am merely a servant, Lady Renata. I carry trays. I clean floors. I have no place in matters of pack strategy." Something flickered across Renata's face, frustration mixed with something colder, more dangerous. "You are a poor liar," she said finally. "But it does not matter. Whatever seeds of doubt you may have planted will wither soon enough, once the southern conflict runs its natural course." A thin, humorless smile crossed her lips. "Kale rides into a trap of his own making, and there is nothing you or anyone else can do to stop it now." Elena's blood went cold. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Renata said softly, leaning closer, "that a king who trusts a human servant over his own beta deserves whatever consequences follow from that misplaced trust. You should have stayed silent, girl. It would have been kinder, in the end, for everyone involved." Before Elena could respond, Renata waved a dismissive hand toward the door. "Leave me, and remember what I have said. Silence this time would be wise." Elena left the chamber with her pulse racing, Renata's words echoing in her mind with growing dread. A trap of his own making. Whatever Renata had planned, it was already unfolding, already drawing Kale deeper into danger with every mile he traveled south, and there was no way to warn him, no way to reach him before whatever awaited him at the border came to pass. She spent that night pacing the narrow confines of her small room, turning over every possible option in her mind. She could not ride south herself, had no means of sending a message swiftly enough to matter, had no allies within the fortress powerful enough to intervene on her behalf. She felt, for the first time since arriving at Moonfall, truly and completely helpless. It was 3 days later when the wounded began returning. Word spread through the fortress like wildfire, servants and wolves alike gathering in anxious clusters as the first riders limped back through the gates, bloodied and exhausted, bearing news of an ambush at the southern border. Crosspack had not simply been testing boundaries, it seemed. They had been drawing Cale's forces into a carefully prepared trap, one that had very nearly succeeded in overwhelming the smaller company he had brought with him. Elena's hands shook as she helped tend to the wounded, moving through the makeshift infirmary that had been hastily assembled in the fortress's lower halls, searching every face for some sign of Cale himself, terrified of what she might find, or fail to find, among the returning wolves. "The king," she asked one of the wounded soldiers, a young wolf whose arm had been bound in bloodied cloth. "Is he safe?" "He fought his way clear," the soldier said, wincing as Greta tightened the bandage around his wound. "But it was close. Too close. If not for his own strength, we would have lost him entirely." The soldier's eyes darkened. Someone knew our exact route. Someone knew where and when to strike. This was no accident. Elena's stomach twisted with a mixture of relief and fury. Cale had survived, but only barely, and only because of his own strength, rather than any advantage his position should have afforded him. Renata's treachery had come dangerously close to costing him everything. Cale himself returned to the fortress 2 days later, his expression grim, a fresh wound stretching along his jaw that had not yet fully healed, despite the accelerated recovery wolves were known for. He called an immediate, private meeting, summoning only his most trusted commanders, and, to Elena's surprise, requesting her presence as well. "Tell them what you told me," he instructed her, once the chamber door had been sealed, his voice hard, with barely restrained anger. "Everything you overheard, before I left." Elena repeated the conversation she had witnessed weeks before, watching the faces of the assembled commanders shift from skepticism to horrified understanding as the pieces of Renata's betrayal fell into place. The ambush. The manufactured aggression from Crosspack, which, as it turned out, had been coordinated in advance through secret correspondence Renata had been conducting for months. The deliberate weakening of Cale's authority, orchestrated from within his own inner circle. "She nearly succeeded," one of the older commanders said grimly, once Elena had finished. "Had you fallen at that border, my lord, the pack would have descended into chaos. Renata would have positioned herself as the only wolf strong enough to hold Moonfall together." Cale's jaw tightened, his eyes burning with a cold fury that made even his most senior commanders shift uncomfortably. "Bring her to me," he said quietly, "now." Renata did not go quietly. When the guards arrived to bring her before Cale, she fought them with the full strength of her rank, wounding 2 before she was finally subdued and dragged into the great hall in chains, her eyes blazing with a mixture of fury and defiance that left no doubt about her guilt. "You would believe a human servant over your own beta," she spat, kneeling before the throne with her chains rattling against the stone floor. "A wolf who has served your family since before you were born, discarded for the word of a girl who does not even belong in this fortress." "I would believe evidence," Cale said coldly, and the evidence, once uncovered, confirmed every word she spoke. "Your correspondence with Crosspack was found in your own chambers, Renata. Your betrayal is not a matter of belief, it is a matter of fact." The hall fell silent, every wolf present understanding the gravity of what was unfolding before them. Betrayal of this magnitude, from a wolf of Renata's standing, was almost unheard of within Moonfall's long history, and the punishment for such treachery was severe. "I did what was necessary," Renata said, her voice rising, desperate now beneath the fury. "You are too young, too untested, to hold this pack together. I did what your father would have wanted, had he seen how weak his son has become." "My father," Cale said, his voice dangerously quiet, "would never have sold his own pack to a rival alpha for the sake of personal ambition. Whatever weakness you believe you saw in me, It does not compare to the weakness of a wolf, who would sacrifice her own people to seize power that was never hers to take. Renata was exiled that same day, stripped of her rank and cast beyond Moonfall's borders, forbidden ever to return under threat of death. It was not the harshest punishment available to him, Elena understood, watching from the edges of the hall. But it was, perhaps, the most fitting. A wolf who had craved power above all else, left with nothing at all. In the days that followed, the fortress settled into an uneasy but genuine calm, the tension that had gripped its halls for weeks, finally beginning to ease now that the source of its instability had been removed. Cale worked tirelessly to reorganize his command, promoting wolves whose loyalty had never wavered, rebuilding the trust that Renata's betrayal had so severely damaged. Elena found herself, in the aftermath, treated differently by nearly everyone within the fortress. Word had spread of her role in exposing Renata's treachery, and while some wolves still regarded her with the same wary suspicion they extended to all humans, others began to show her a kind of cautious respect she had never expected to receive within these walls. It was during this uneasy period of rebuilding that Elena first met Mother Isolde, the pack's aging seer, a wolf so old that her fur had turned entirely silver, her eyes clouded with the particular wisdom that came only from decades of witnessing things others could not see. Isolde found Elena one afternoon in the fortress gardens, where Elena had been sent to gather herbs for the kitchen, and the old seer's sudden appearance beside her made Elena startle so badly she nearly dropped her basket. "Forgive me, child," Isolde said, her voice carrying a warmth that immediately put Elena at ease, despite the surprise. "I did not mean to frighten you. I have been wanting to speak with you for some time now, ever since word reached me of what happened in the Great Hall, the night you sang." Elena's cheeks flushed. "It was nothing, truly. Just an old song my mother taught me." "Was it?" Isolde's clouded eyes seemed to see far more than Elena was comfortable with. "Tell me, child, has this song always calmed those who heard it, even before you came to this fortress?" Elena hesitated, thinking back over years of humming that same melody while working, while walking, while comforting her younger siblings during difficult nights. She had never truly noticed any unusual effect before, but then again, she had rarely sung it around wolves before coming to Moonfall. "I do not know," she admitted. "I have never had reason to notice." Isolde nodded slowly, as though confirming some private suspicion. "There is an old bloodline, child, nearly forgotten by most, humans known long ago as the Songbound. Their voices held power over wolf and beast alike, an ability to calm, to command, to soothe even the most violent instincts with nothing more than melody and intention. It was said the Songbound could quiet an entire pack mid-battle, could bring peace where blood and fury had reigned only moments before. Elena's breath caught. "You believe I am one of them?" "I believe," Isolde said carefully, "that what you did in that hall was no ordinary song. I believe the pull I have felt from you since we first stood in this garden together is no ordinary presence." The Songbound bloodline was thought extinct centuries ago, but bloodlines have a way of surviving in unexpected places, waiting quietly for the right moment to awaken. The weight of the old seer's words settled heavily over Elena, equal parts wonder and fear. If what Isolde believed was true, then she was not merely a servant girl, caught up in circumstances beyond her control. She carried something ancient within her, something powerful, something that had already begun to shape the fate of an entire kingdom, without her even understanding what she was doing. "Does the king know of this?" Elena asked quietly. "Not yet," Isolde said, "but he will need to, and soon. A gift like yours does not remain hidden forever, especially not now that Crosspack has felt the sting of a failed ambush and will be searching for any advantage to press against Moonfall's borders once again." Elena carried the weight of that conversation with her for days, uncertain how or when to share it with Cale, uncertain what it might mean for her future within the fortress, if the truth of her bloodline became widely known. She had come to Moonfall as a debt to be paid, an unwilling servant sentenced to a life of quiet labor. She had not expected to become something else entirely, something that ancient stories and old prophecies might one day speak of. Cale found her that evening in the fortress gardens, drawn, he admitted, by some restless need to see her after the difficult days of reorganizing his command. He looked lighter than she had seen him in weeks, the immediate threat of Renata's betrayal finally behind him, though new concerns had clearly already begun to settle across his shoulders. "You seem troubled," he observed, settling onto the low stone bench beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him despite the evening chill. Elena hesitated only a moment before deciding that honesty, however uncertain its consequences, was the only path forward. "Mother Isolde spoke with me today," she said carefully. "She believes I carry the blood of an old lineage, one thought extinct for centuries. Humans called the songbound, whose voices could calm wolves, could command them, even in the midst of violence." Cale's expression shifted, surprise giving way to something more thoughtful, more careful, as he turned her words over in his mind. "That would explain what I felt, that night in the Great Hall," he said slowly. "I have wondered about it since, unable to fully account for the way your song affected me, affected the entire room. I assumed it was simply the melody itself, something familiar and comforting. But if what Isolde believes is true, then I am not entirely human," Elena finished quietly. "Or not simply human, in the way you have always understood the word." Cale studied her for a long moment, and Elena braced herself for a shift in his expression, for the careful distance that such a revelation might place between a king and a servant who had suddenly become something far more significant, far more complicated, than either of them had anticipated. But instead, something in his eyes softened, the same warmth she had glimpsed before in quiet, unguarded moments. "It changes nothing about who you are," he said finally. "Whatever gift runs through your blood, it does not erase the courage you showed in warning me of Renata's betrayal, knowing full well the danger you risked by speaking at all. It does not erase the kindness I have watched you show to servants and wolves alike, expecting nothing in return. If anything, Elena, it only confirms what I have already begun to suspect." "And what is that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Cale reached out, hesitant at first, and gently took her hand in his, a gesture so simple and yet so charged with meaning that Elena felt her heart nearly still entirely. "That you are far more than the debt your family owed this pack," he said quietly. "That you are far more than a servant sentenced to labor within these walls. I do not yet know what that means, for either of us, given everything that stands between your position and mine, but I find I no longer wish to pretend otherwise." Elena did not pull her hand away. For the first time since arriving at Moonfall, chained and terrified and utterly alone, she allowed herself to feel something other than fear or determination or grief for the life she had left behind. She allowed herself, if only for a moment, to feel hope. Word of Elena's true nature could not remain contained within the fortress walls forever, and it did not take long for whispers to reach beyond Moonfall's borders, carried by the same restless currents of gossip and rumor that traveled between rival packs regardless of any wall or guard meant to contain them. Crosspack, still smarting from the failed ambush that had nearly claimed Cale's life, seized upon the news with an eagerness that boded ill for everyone involved. The alpha of Crosspack, a ruthless and ambitious wolf named Draven Cross, had spent years searching for any advantage that might tip the long-standing rivalry between the two packs decisively in his favor. A human servant with the power to calm and command wolves through voice alone represented precisely the kind of asset he had always dreamed of possessing, and he wasted no time devising a plan to acquire her for himself. The attack came without warning, on a morning that had begun like any other. Elena had been sent to the fortress gardens to gather herbs, accompanied only by a young servant girl named Mira, when a group of cross-pack wolves descended upon them, with terrifying speed and precision. Mira screamed and fled toward the fortress, but Elena, caught off guard and unable to outrun wolves built for speed and violence, found herself surrounded within seconds. "Do not fight," one of the wolves growled, his eyes glinting with predatory satisfaction. "Our alpha has need of your particular talents. You will come with us, quietly, and no harm will come to you." Elena's mind raced, terror threatening to overwhelm her rational thought entirely. But some instinct, some quiet strength that had carried her through every hardship since arriving at Moonfall, kept her steady enough to think clearly despite the fear coursing through her veins. She thought of the song, of the power Isolde believed ran through her blood, and wondered desperately whether it might be enough to save her now. She began to sing, her voice trembling but audible, the same melody that had once calmed an entire hall of restless wolves. For a moment, she saw the wolves around her hesitate, their aggressive postures faltering slightly beneath the pull of her voice. But whatever power she carried, it was not yet strong enough, not yet controlled enough, to overcome wolves who had come prepared and determined to capture her regardless of any resistance she might offer. Before she could finish the melody, a sharp blow to the back of her head sent the world spinning into darkness. Elena woke sometime later in an unfamiliar chamber, her wrists bound, her head throbbing with a dull, persistent ache. The room around her was cold and sparse, clearly a prison of some kind despite its relatively comfortable furnishings, and through a narrow window she could see unfamiliar mountains rising in the distance, confirming her worst fear. She was no longer within Moonfall's borders. The door opened, and a wolf entered, whose presence immediately made her blood run cold, even before he spoke. He was larger than Kale, his features harder, his eyes carrying none of the warmth she had come to associate with the Alpha King of Moonfall. This, she understood immediately, could only be Draven Cross. "Elena Marsh," he said, his voice carrying a satisfaction that made her skin crawl. "The song-bound girl who has caused Kale Draven so much trouble. I must admit, I did not fully believe the rumors when they first reached me. A human with power over wolves, thought extinct for centuries, appearing now, of all times, in my rival's fortress." He circled her slowly, studying her the way a merchant might study a particularly valuable acquisition. "You will prove very useful to me." "I will not help you," Elena said, forcing steadiness into her voice, despite the fear churning in her stomach. "Whatever you believe I can do for you, I will not use it against Moonfall or its people." Cross's expression darkened, the false civility of his earlier tone dropping away entirely. "You will do exactly as I command," he said coldly, "or you will discover precisely how unpleasant life within my fortress can become, for those who refuse me. I have no particular need for your comfort, girl, only your voice and your obedience." He left her alone after that, chained and frightened but resolute, her mind already working through every possible avenue of escape or resistance. She thought of Kale, of the warmth in his eyes the night he had held her hand in the fortress gardens, and wondered desperately whether he even knew yet that she had been taken, whether he was searching for her at this very moment, or whether Crosspack's assault had succeeded in erasing her from Moonfall entirely. She did not have to wonder for long. Word of Elena's abduction reached Kale within hours, carried by a terrified Mira who had run the entire distance back to the fortress without stopping, gasping out the details of the attack between desperate sobs. Kale's reaction, those who witnessed it later described, was unlike anything they had seen from their king before, a fury so complete and so immediate that even his most senior commanders instinctively stepped back from him. "Assemble every available wolf," he commanded, his voice carrying a barely controlled violence that left no room for argument or hesitation. "We ride for Crosspack's territory within the hour." "My lord," one of his commanders ventured carefully, riding directly into Crosspack territory, especially so soon after the ambush at our southern border, carries enormous risk. "If this is a trap designed to draw you out—" "I do not care," Kale snapped, cutting him off entirely. "Elena is in that fortress because of me, because Cross seeks to use her power against everything I have built. I will not leave her there a single day longer than necessary, trap or no trap." His commanders exchanged worried glances but did not argue further, recognizing in their king's expression a determination that would not be swayed by caution or careful strategy. Within the hour, a company of Moonfall's finest wolves rode south and east toward Crosspack territory, Kale himself at their head, driven by a desperation and fury that had nothing to do with pack politics, and everything to do with the girl who had, somehow, in the space of only a few short weeks, become more important to him than his own safety. Mother Isolde, watching the company depart from the fortress gates, turned to Greta with an expression that mixed worry and cautious hope in equal measure. "He rides not as a king, protecting a valuable asset," the old seer observed quietly, "but as a wolf, fighting for his mate. Whatever happens in Crosspack's fortress, I do not believe Elena Marsh will remain simply a servant to this pack for much longer." Greta said nothing, her own worried gaze fixed on the disappearing riders, praying silently that whatever awaited them at their destination would not cost either Kale or Elena more than either of them could bear to give. Elena spent 2 days imprisoned within Crosspack's fortress, refusing every demand Draven Cross made of her, enduring his growing frustration, with a quiet, stubborn resolve that surprised even herself. He tried threats. He tried false promises of comfort and reward. He even attempted at one point to force her into using her voice against her will, dragging her before a group of his own restless wolves and commanding her to sing. Elena had refused, choosing instead to remain silent no matter how he threatened her, understanding instinctively that whatever power she carried was not something that could be forced from her against her will. "You test my patience," Cross growled on the second evening, his composure finally beginning to crack beneath her continued defiance. "I could simply take what I want from you, girl. Do not think my restraint will last forever." "Then you will discover," Elena said, meeting his eyes with a steadiness she did not entirely feel, "that whatever gift I carry does not answer to force. It answers only to intention, and mine will never align with yours." Cross's expression twisted with fury, and for a terrifying moment, Elena believed he might strike her. But before he could act, a commotion erupted somewhere beyond the chamber walls, shouts, and the sound of fighting echoing through the fortress corridors. Cross's head snapped toward the door, his expression shifting from fury to alarm. Kael had arrived. What followed was chaos, a violent clash between Moonfall and Crosspack wolves that spread rapidly through the fortress, as Kael's company fought their way toward the chamber where Elena was held. Elena listened to the sounds of battle drawing closer, her heart pounding with a mixture of terror and desperate hope, praying that Kael would reach her before the fighting claimed too heavy a cost on either side. The chamber door burst open, and Kael stood in the doorway, blood staining his clothing, his eyes blazing with a fury that softened instantly into overwhelming relief the moment he saw her, chained but unharmed, waiting for him exactly as he had prayed she would be. Elena. Her name left him like a breath he had been holding since the moment he learned of her abduction. He crossed the room in 3 swift strides, breaking her chains with his bare hands, pulling her into an embrace so fierce and so relieved that Elena felt tears finally spill down her cheeks, tears she had refused to allow herself throughout the entire ordeal. "You came," she whispered against his chest. "I will always come for you," Kael said fiercely, pulling back just enough to study her face, checking for any sign of harm Cross might have inflicted upon her. "Are you hurt?" "No," Elena said. "He threatened, but he did not touch me. I refused him at every turn." Something fierce and proud flickered across Kael's expression. "Of course you did." The sound of fighting still echoed beyond the chamber, and Kael's expression hardened once more, the warmth giving way to grim determination. "We need to move. Cross's forces are not yet defeated, and I will not risk your safety a moment longer than necessary." But as they made their way through the fortress corridors, fighting still raging around them, they found their path blocked by Draven Cross himself, flanked by a dozen of his most loyal wolves, his expression twisted with rage and desperation in equal measure. "You will not simply walk out of my fortress with what belongs to me," Cross snarled. "She belongs to no one," Kael said coldly, positioning himself protectively in front of Elena, "least of all you." What followed was a tense standoff, wolves on both sides bristling with barely restrained violence, the entire corridor thick with the promise of further bloodshed. Elena, watching the scene unfold with growing horror, understood suddenly and clearly that more lives were about to be lost, more suffering inflicted, all because of the power she carried within her voice. She would not allow it. Stepping forward despite Kael's attempt to hold her back, Elena drew a steadying breath and began to sing, her voice carrying through the corridor, with a clarity and strength she had never managed before, born from desperation and a fierce determination to end this conflict before it claimed more lives than it already had. The melody filled the fortress, rising above the sounds of fighting, and one by one, wolves on both sides began to falter, their aggressive postures softening beneath the pull of her voice, weapons lowering despite themselves. Even Draven Cross, for all his fury, found himself unable to resist the power of her song entirely, his snarl fading into something closer to stunned silence, as Elena's voice wove through the corridor, calming violence that had seemed only moments before entirely unstoppable. "Enough," Elena said, once the last echoes of her song had faded and silence had settled over the corridor, broken only by the ragged breathing of wolves on both sides, slowly regaining their senses. Enough bloodshed. Enough war. This ends now, or it ends with every one of you dead, and nothing gained by either side. Cross stared at her, something between fear and grudging respect flickering across his features. You are more dangerous than I anticipated, he admitted finally, his voice rough. I am not your weapon, Elena said firmly, and I never will be. Release your claim on this conflict, Draven Cross, and allow us to leave in peace, or I promise you, whatever power I carry will be turned entirely against you and everyone who follows you. The threat, delivered with quiet conviction rather than anger, seemed to accomplish what an entire company of Moonfall wolves could not. Cross, recognizing the shift in the balance of power that had just occurred within his own fortress, gave a curt, reluctant nod. Take her, he said finally, stepping aside. But know this, Kael Draven. This is not finished between our packs. Not truly. No, Kael agreed grimly, pulling Elena close once more. But today, it ends here. The journey back to Moonfall passed in a blur of exhaustion and lingering fear, Elena, riding beside Kael for the entire distance, unwilling to be separated from him even for a moment, after everything they had both endured. The fortress gates opened to greet them with a warmth Elena had never expected to feel upon returning to the place that had once been her prison. Wolves and servants alike gathering to witness their king, and the songbound girl who had, in the span of only a few short weeks, become something far more significant to the pack than either of them had anticipated. Mother Isolde greeted them first, her clouded eyes studying Elena with an expression of quiet satisfaction. The bloodline has finally proven itself, she said softly. Not merely a gift for calming restless halls, but a power capable of ending wars before they claim more than they already have. In the days that followed, word spread throughout Moonfall's territory of what had happened within Crosspack's fortress, of the human servant girl whose voice had brought an entire corridor of warring wolves to their knees, ending a conflict that had threatened to consume both packs in bloodshed. The wolves who had once regarded Elena with suspicion or outright dismissal now looked upon her with something closer to reverence, understanding at last that the quiet, unassuming servant who had scrubbed their floors and hauled their water carried within her a power older and more significant than most of them could have imagined. Kael called a full gathering of the pack in the Great Hall, the same hall where Elena had first been sentenced to servitude, the same hall where she had first hummed a melody that had changed everything between them. He stood before his assembled people, Elena beside him rather than behind him, a positioning that carried its own quiet significance that did not go unnoticed by anyone present. Many of you know by now what happened at Crosspack's fortress, Kael began, his voice carrying easily through the silent hall. You know that Elena Marsh, once sentenced to this fortress as payment for a debt her family could not afford, saved not only my life, but the lives of every wolf who rode with me into that conflict. She ended a war before it could claim more than it already had, using a gift that our own histories had long believed extinct. He turned to face her directly, and Elena felt her heart quicken beneath the weight of his gaze, uncertain what he intended to say next, but trusting him entirely regardless. I stand before you today to renounce the law that first brought Elena to this fortress in chains, Kael continued, his voice firm and unwavering. No debt, no tithe, no ancient tradition of servitude will ever again bind a human to this pack against their will, and I stand before you to declare, before every wolf gathered in this hall, that Elena Marsh is not my servant. He reached for her hand, and Elena felt tears gathering in her eyes as she understood, finally, fully, what he intended to say. She is my equal, my mate, and should she consent to accept it, my queen. The hall erupted, not into the murmurs of suspicion that had greeted Elena's arrival weeks before, but into something far different entirely. One by one, wolves throughout the hall began to bow, not out of the fear that had once governed every interaction within these walls, but out of genuine reverence for a girl who had proven herself, through courage and compassion, and an ancient gift she had never asked for, to be worthy of standing beside their king. Elena looked out over the sea of bowed heads, remembering the terrified girl who had first arrived at these gates in chains, remembering every moment of fear and exhaustion and quiet defiance that had carried her through the difficult weeks since. She thought of her family, waiting still in Ashwood, and knew with certainty that she would see them again soon, not as a servant seeking permission to visit, but as a queen with the power and the freedom to travel as she chose. "Yes," she said softly, turning to Cale, her voice carrying easily through the now silent hall, despite its quietness. "I accept." The cheer that rose through the great hall in response was unlike anything Elena had heard since her arrival at Moonfall, wolves and human servants alike, celebrating a union that represented far more than the joining of two individuals. It represented the beginning of something new for the entire pack, a future built not on fear and suspicion, but on the kind of genuine respect and partnership that Elena had, without ever intending to, taught them all to value. In the months that followed, Elena settled into her new role with the same quiet determination that had carried her through every hardship since her arrival, working alongside Cale to rebuild trust between Moonfall and the human villages that had long lived in uneasy tension with the pack's authority. The old tithe system was abolished entirely, replaced by fairer agreements that benefited both wolves and humans alike. Ashwood, her own village, became one of the first to enter into this new arrangement, and Elena had the joy of returning home, not as a debt paid, but as a queen extending genuine friendship to the family and neighbors she had once feared she would never see again. Draven Cross did not trouble Moonfall's borders again, at least not for many years, having learned firsthand the cost of underestimating the power that a single voice, wielded with courage and compassion, could hold over even the fiercest of wolves. And within Moonfall's own fortress, the memory of Renata's betrayal faded gradually into a lesson rather than an open wound, a reminder to every wolf who served under Cale's rule that strength alone was never enough to hold a pack together. It required trust, it required honesty, it required, as Elena had shown them all, the courage to stand for what was right, even when every instinct urged silence and self-preservation instead. Elena Marsh, once a servant girl ordered to serve the Alpha King against her will, had become instead his equal, his partner, and the beating heart of a pack that had finally learned to bow, not out of fear, but out of genuine and lasting reverence for the voice that had saved them all. And in the quiet evenings that followed, when the great hall fell silent and the fortress settled into peaceful rest, Elena would still sometimes hum the old melody her mother had taught her, watching with quiet contentment as the wolves around her, no longer strangers but family, settled into calm and easy peace beneath the gentle pull of her voice. The Songbound had returned to the world at last, and the kingdom of Moonfall would never be the same again.